Today, there are 2 million descendants of French-Canadian immigrants living in New England. These are our stories. Welcome to the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Venez tous jeunes filles et garçons, je vais vous raconter l'histoire de notre immigration ici au USA, de grands aventuriers de pays étrangers.
This is the French-Canadian Legacy Podcast. I am Jesse Martineau. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I received an email from Cecile Thornton, someone known to many of the listeners of this podcast. And in the email, she sent me a link to a podcast episode that she thought I might find interesting. Of course, any podcast suggestion from Cecile is something I'm going to check out. So I clicked on the link and tuned into a podcast called Revolution Bilingue. And it was an interview in French with Professor Paul Buck of the University of Maine Fort Kent. And the discussion was super interesting, so I reached out and asked Dr. Buck to be a guest on this podcast as well. Dr. Buck is a professor of history and education at the University of Maine at Fort Kent. He has a doctorate in United States and Canadian history from the University of Maine, which he completed in 2008. He's proficient in a ton of languages and has either studied or taught in French Canada, Russia, and Senegal, among other places. And Paul enjoys participating in his adopted community of St. Agatha, particularly in local organizations that celebrate French language and Acadian and Franco-American culture of the St. John Valley. Dr. Buck, welcome to the French Canadian Legacy Podcast.
Thank you, Jesse. Merci beaucoup. It's great to be with you.
Now, before we get going, talking about specifically about Fort Kent or maybe even some of your research interests, I'd like to get your story, because your story is definitely unique, not with the common story that we hear on this podcast frequently. So where are you from? What's your background?
Sure. So basically, I was born in Maryland, in Annapolis, Maryland, home of the U.S. Naval Academy and the state capital as well, in 1969. Don't mind sharing my age with folks out there. I am of African-American descent, Anglophone. But I first started studying French when I went to Montreal as a teenager at 14 years old. And I went on a trip there with my mom and with my grandmother as well, and didn't speak a word of French, and said, this is something I would really like to learn, the Quebecois culture, but French language. And since that time, I've become very interested in Acadian culture as well. And of course, being in northernmost Maine, it's really at the crossroads of Lower South Shore Quebec culture as well as Acadian culture. Most folks, of course, in northern Maine tend to self-assume or to self-appropriate is the term I'm looking for, Acadian identity, certainly. So that's largely my background. I also had done my undergraduate at St. Lawrence in northern New York. That's right, 20 miles basically, or 30 kilometers for our friends who prefer metric, from the St. Lawrence River roughly, and about 2 hours from Montreal, about an hour and a half from Ottawa, but on the New York side of the international border though. So in the United States. And then I did a master's at Middlebury in Spanish. Again, spent, as Jesse was kind enough to mention, I'd spent a year as a Fulbrighter in Senegal, and I'd also had a Fulbright to Quebec during my doctoral studies in Orono at the University of Maine. That would have been 2006. And I was in Dakar from 1997 to 1998 as a Fulbright exchange teacher. Sadly, that program has lost a great deal of its funding, but at the time it was common for K-12 teachers to have a year in a country outside of the U.S. to be able to teach, and then you would have an exchange partner from that country take your classes. And so my exchange partner took my French classes at the private school where I was teaching at that time in Maryland. So that's just the basic, les grandes lignes, the kind of the overview of my own background.
Which is so awesome, because most of the people we have on this podcast essentially come into this, the Franco-American world because they're born into it. And it's something that they've always grown up with their entire life. And so to see somebody who's now an expert in this field, who is completely separated from all this, not from New England, no French background, is super, super interesting.
Well, thank you, Jesse. And it's interesting for me just from this point of view. When I first went to Quebec, and obviously Franco-Americans as well as Acadians have, as we know, with some of the laws that were passed in New England during the 1900s, had a great deal of discrimination. And Obviously, being of African American descent, this is part of my own cultural journey as well, just in a broad sense, in a group sense of that.
Sure.
I don't always like to tune into what people have necessarily overcome, but it certainly did strike a chord with me, noticing in Montreal in the 1980s, just the fight for linguistic, not just recognition, but for linguistic promotion in Quebec, etc. That struck me, but certainly among Franco-Americans, again, descended largely from Quebec, also Acadia, both. I found that so very interesting, just knowing that here in the state of Maine, from 1919 until the late 1960s, it was illegal to teach French as anything but a foreign language in school. And when we think about the St. John Valley, and we think about the history of this place, French settlers were here in the 1780s. That border was drawn in 1842. So if there was, or if there were a foreign language in this valley that was of European descent, it's English and
Absolutely.
not French. So the fact that that was done for 50, 60 years,
Sure.
that law was on the books. When we think about even the history of just the St. John Valley, yes, obviously Lewiston, Auburn, Biddeford, it's a different story as far as Franco-Americans are concerned, for the most part. But here in the Valley, the country came to the folks here and not the other way around. It was the Yankee lumberers that started to come up in the 1820s that tended to bring more English up to the part of the St. John Valley where I live now. So again, it just, as a historian, it really kind of strikes you as being a bit difficult, to put it diplomatically.
Sure.
That such a law was on the books. But anyway, my own background, even though I don't always dive into just the idea of having to always overcome something, still, it is certainly a part of what I grew up with, and it's something that resonated with me with both Franco-Americans and Quebecois, as well as Acadians. So it's something I've always kind of been drawn to, just for that reason.
Sure.
It hits at a very, je ressens ça au trip, comme on dit au Québec. You feel it at a gut level, so.
No, that's awesome. And that is really, I mean, the region you're in, which we're going to get to, of course, is super fascinating. That entire story is super fascinating. I remember we had someone told us on the podcast once about how, my ancestors crossed the border, whereas the border crossed them. Which is the main difference.
Absolutely.
Which I thought was
Absolutely.
super great. But so,
Yeah.
Speaking of, you're at UMaine Fort Kent.
Mhm.
How does someone from Annapolis, Maryland, even first hear of Fort Kent, Maine? Honestly, growing up in Manchester, New Hampshire, not a place I had ever heard of until I started doing this podcast.
No problem. So basically, as far as Fort Kent, I was aware of it even before, because of doing my undergrad at St. Lawrence, and I did it in Canadian studies and multi-languages with French as my language of concentration. So there was
Gotcha.
I was already kind of attuned to not only Franco-Americans, and in Northern New York, in the North Country of New York, lots of
Sure.
Franco-Americans as well, lots and lots, but also those who are Quebecois, as well as French Canadians in the broadest sense of that term, obviously being on the border, an hour and a half from Ottawa, lots of Franco-Ontarians as well, especially get over toward Cornwall, east end of Ottawa, over toward Hawkesbury. Despite the English name Hawkesbury, it's about 85%, 90% French. So I've always been kind of attuned to it. So I knew of Fort Kent even before I came to Maine, which would have been in 2001. And that's when I started at Orono to undertake my PhD work in U.S. and Canadian history. So I knew of Fort Kent back then, and even when I was a grad student in Orono, I took a drive up to the valley.
Nice.
I don't even know, 2003, 2004, before I knew I was going to come here
Sure.
to teach in 2008, and actually taught for 1 year at Wisdom Middle High School in Saint Agathe, in the same town where I live. A lot of folks say Saint Agatha, but of course Saint Agathe is the way that it would be pronounced in French. Even elsewhere in Maine, in the Bangor area, most people I know that don't speak a word of French pronounce it Saint Agathe and not
that's
Saint
awesome.
Agatha.
That's
so
cool.
So even, and again, Bangor is our nearest service center on the U.S. side of the border. Obviously, Edmundston for us is a half an hour away, so
Yeah.
it's actually closer than going to Bangor. But as far as our nearest large service center, it would be Bangor. Of course, next nearest would be Presque Isle, about an hour away. But yeah, so I knew of Fort Kent even when I was in grad school, even before that, even back to when I was at St. Lawrence as an undergrad, Fort Kent, Madawaska, the Madawaska settlement, and that kind of thing. So I was very fortunate to have had that type of education. And also, even as a high school student in Maryland, I was blessed to be able to have lots of language classes. I was able to get my math credits out of the way as a sophomore, actually.
Oh, that's wild.
And yeah, and I was able to finish up with my social studies credits as a junior. So I had free time as a senior to be able to take German. I'd already taken AP German, but I was able to get an extra year, so I got bumped up in German. So AP German, German 5. And then my senior year, I was in French 4 and in Spanish 2. So I
That's
taught myself
wild.
Spanish. Yeah, it was fun. I started teaching myself Spanish in addition to teaching myself French at first after my trip to Montreal. And then I was able to test into French 3 as a junior, and then took French 4 as a senior in high school. And then Spanish, because it's the second most spoken language in the United States,
For
I
sure.
mean,
Yeah.
I wanted to learn it just out of interest. I don't have the passion quite for Spanish that I do for French, but I certainly have a respect and an interest, a very big interest, because of being in the United States and with it being the second most spoken language. And it's close to French too. Both have
There
Latin
you go.
roots, so
Yeah.
that
No,
helped me to learn Spanish.
that's
But
very cool. No, this is cool. Now, before we get too far, I guess I think maybe we should do a little bit of an overview, 10,000 feet, big picture of
sure.
Fort Kent, Maine, if we could. We've talked about it a little bit on the podcast before. Obviously,
Mhm.
we've had Patrick Lacroix on a number of times.
Awesome.
Big
Patrick's awesome.
big
Il est
friend of the
très bien, Patrick. Oui, absolument.
big friend of the podcast.
C'est parfait, so that's perfect.
But for those who might not be super familiar, I guess overview, big picture, where are we talking about? We talking about Fort Kent, and just broad overview. We've already talked
Mhm.
about the whole border crossing them thing. What is the history of this area?
Okay. So what's interesting is that and I will not assume knowledge of Maine geography for your listeners, so I'll kind of
Please.
start with the most basic pieces of the puzzle here. So to drive from Kittery, which is right across from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, up to Fort Kent, if you drive the speed limit, you're probably talking 7 hours, somewhere in there. So we're
Yeah.
talking about quite a distance. And keep in mind as well, for folks who are not as familiar with New England geography, that the entire state of Maine is large enough to accommodate, in terms of area, the other 5 New England states. So that gives you an idea.
That's wild.
This is the northernmost extremity of the state of Maine. To give you an idea in terms of geography, I'm sitting here in Fort Kent. It's as fast for me to go to Quebec City as it is to go to Bangor, they're both about 3 hours from where
That's
I'm sitting.
wild. Yep.
Yeah. So
And that's south of where you are.
correct. It's west southwest. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's west southwest. Quebec City would be. Yeah, it's just slightly south of due west. Yeah, so west southwest of Fort Kent. So it's fascinating as well if you think about the nearest big city,
Sure.
larger than say Portland or Bangor or something like that. Our nearest, by about a half an hour, our nearest world-class city, and even if you take Quebec City out of the mix, and you could make an argument for Quebec City, but if we want to talk in terms of Montreal or Boston, Montreal's closer than Boston is for us by about
That's
a half an hour,
wild.
even though we're in New England. So
Right.
again, it's well, yes, it is geographically in New England, but it's oh my gosh, 8 hours from Boston, roughly 8.5. It depends on how you drive it, obviously, but if you do the speed limit, probably about 8 hours. Yeah, but Montreal is 6 and change, maybe 7 hours roughly from here. So we're actually closer. And plus, it's all once you get to Edmundston, with the exception of a small, I'm thinking French and Tronçon, a small portion of road on the Quebec side that they're now widening. But with that small, maybe 20 kilometers, so what's that, like 13 miles maybe, worth of 2-lane road, it's all 4 lanes between
wow.
once you get on the
Okay.
Trans-Canada in Edmundston and go to Montreal, with the
Sure.
exception of that little 20-kilometer piece. Whereas for us to go to Boston, it's all 2-lane roads all the way down to I-95. It's a good 2.5 hour drive, and then it's 4 lanes from there. So it's almost all 4-lane roads for us from here. Now, again, from Fort Kent to get to Edmundston, it's a half an hour, it's 2-lane roads. But once you get to Edmundston, which is right across from Madawaska, Maine, for folks who don't know, get on the Trans-Canada, it's all 4 lanes with the exception of that very, very small portion that they're now widening in Quebec to 4 lanes. So again, it's fascinating when you think of that piece of the geography too. And another thing that I'd mentioned on the podcast you've been referencing this summer, and Fabrice Jomont, wonderful, wonderful human being. And I was so
Absolutely.
grateful to be on his podcast as well on Révolution Bilingue on French Morning. One thing I'd mentioned there, and I'll mention it here too, is if we think in terms beyond geopolitics, beyond international borders, and think just in terms of culture and language. Often it's said once you get out of the St. John Valley, and that would be 25 minutes south of here, roughly. And it's, again, about a 3-hour drive to Bangor. It's about 180 miles, roughly, from Fort Kent to Bangor. And then, gosh, about 120, 130, I want to say, to Portland, and then another 45 miles or so, 40 to 45, until the Maine-New Hampshire border at Kittery and Portsmouth, basically. The interesting thing, though, is that especially even in the Bangor area, and I still have many friends down there from my graduate studies, it's often thought that this area of northernmost Maine is, quote, to the end of the world, unquote. But I'll tell you, if you think in linguistic terms, it's in the middle of the action. It is not at the end of anything. It's right in the middle between Quebec and Acadia. And if you look at a map of northernmost Maine with Quebec and northwestern New Brunswick all together, and you kind of look at where French is spoken, northernmost Maine, the St. John Valley, is in the middle. It's not at the end of anything. It's in the middle.
Sure.
So again, it's all in how we frame it.
Oh,
And yeah, is the geopolitical border important? Of course it is. I mean, I was just going over this with my history class this morning, that the U.S. Border Patrol was established actually this year 100 years ago, so in 1924. And I'm kind of dating the podcast if people listen to this sometime down the road.
yeah.
But it as of the recording of this podcast,
Right.
in 2024, the Border Patrol was established in 1924. So yeah, absolutely. The international borders are important, but when we think in terms of language and we think in terms of continuity of language, northernmost Maine's in the middle of it. It's not at the end of anything at all.
The one you mentioned, how obviously that the French speaking portion, what we've been told here in the podcast is that
Mhm.
essentially the border for generations has almost been ignored, and it's just like one giant community. You have like your parents on one side, your kids on the other side, cross the border almost on a daily basis for one thing
Yeah.
or another, and
Mhm.
nobody really cared. Is that
Yeah.
changing at all now?
It is changing. 9/11 has had a lot to do with that, and then the requirement of passports to come into the U.S. basically.
Gotcha.
That has changed a great deal. As a matter of fact, my colleague and friend Lisa Lavoie, who teaches behavioral science here, and she's a native of the region. She's from Fort Kent. She wrote a master's thesis on the effect of 9/11 on Fort Kent, Maine, and Clare, New Brunswick, and she talked about that very piece of the puzzle. This really, I wouldn't say truncation of cross-border movement, but it certainly has been a slowing of it since the requirement of passports. And people, again, until the insurance regulations changed, and 9/11 really kind of did it in, but insurance regulations, health insurance regulations changed too. Now, again, let's kind of imagine this area without an international border just for a moment. Fort Kent is right across from Clare, New Brunswick. Fort Kent, Maine is right across from Clare. Madawaska, Maine is right across from Edmundston, New Brunswick. I mean, you can literally, from my office here, now the bridge is on the other end of downtown, but I can literally walk to Canada in about 15 minutes from here. I can be in Clare. I can just walk.
Sure.
If I drive it, it's 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Basically, from where I'm sitting here in my office. So with that in mind, that is how folks very often, until again the regulations changed with healthcare and 9/11, women who were expecting in Clare, where was the nearest hospital? Wasn't Edmundston, even though it's the same side of the river and the same side of the border as Clare, New Brunswick is. Nearest hospital with an OBGYN unit at that time was Fort Kent. It has closed since then, but it was certainly an operation for years and years and years. So women who would give birth from Clare, they would come to Fort Kent very
Sure.
often, not
Yeah.
always, but would often come here because it was the nearest hospital. Conversely, and those would be Canadian women, let's say two Canadian parents give birth in the U.S., 14th Amendment, jus soli, American citizen, boom, done. And also Canadian, obviously, because both parents are Canadian. Now, conversely, Madawaska, Maine, right across from Edmundston, if you go to if you're walking in downtown Madawaska on Main Street and you look down the hill, I mean, in certain places, you can see the hospital in Edmundston up on the hill on the other side. That's the nearest hospital. So a lot of women in Madawaska or Frenchville, Maine, or Grand Isle, the towns around Madawaska, nearest hospital was in Edmundston, New Brunswick, Canada. That's where they would have their kids. And at that time, you're born in Canada, you're Canadian, even if you have two American parents. So yeah, I know that the U.S. government has cracked down on, in many ways, on dual citizenship and this kind of thing. But in the eyes of Canada, you're born in Canada. At that time, you're Canadian. So even if the U.S. says, in our eyes, you're only American, you're still Canadian if you were born in Edmundston at that point. And again, same thing on the U.S. side with the 14th Amendment. Of course, that's been in the news for different reasons, which I won't go into here.
Sure.
And that's not my intention at all. But the 14th Amendment here is to talk about, of course, historically, it's a Reconstruction Amendment, which intended to create, basically, to constitutionally mandate citizenship for those who were formerly enslaved that were born on what is now U.S. territory, but it applies to everyone. Born in the U.S., if you're born in Fort Kent, you're born on U.S. On U.S. soil, you are American, just by virtue of that. Again, jus soli, of course, from the Latin. So that was very common in this area on both sides. Now, that's faded a great deal, but the reason why it was there is because the population on both sides of the river has been here that is French. Now, obviously, with native peoples, indigenous peoples, Maliseet and Mi'kmaq, both have been on this territory for thousands of years.
Sure.
When we talk about the first European settlements, though, permanent settlements, very largely French on both sides of the river, back to the 1780s in this part of the St. John River Valley. And again, like I said, that border wasn't drawn until 1842 definitively. Of course, it was a disputed territory from the end of the U.S. Revolution with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the famous Heights of Land that divide waters that flow into the St. Lawrence from those that flow into the Atlantic. And then Great Britain and the United States are fighting about whether the Bay of Fundy is just the Bay of Fundy, as the British would have contended, or whether the Bay of Fundy was part of the Atlantic Ocean, which is what the U.S. Contention was. So creating that difference in heights of, the heights of land that separate these two waterways, the St. Lawrence River from the Atlantic. Again, that's part of the reason why this area was in some dispute up until 1842. But long story being short, on what is now the main side of the river, 6 decades of French speakers being on what is now the main side of the river before they drew that border, like you said, where I said the country came to them, as opposed to them coming to the country at that point. So again, so unique. It's interesting that this area, it's definitely different than other French-speaking areas in New England. There are a couple of places, and I did actually talk about this in my U.S. history class this morning. There are a couple of places where you can put a bit of an asterisk. One of them would be Old Town. Old Town, yeah, because one of the large outmigrations, one of the first outmigrations of people from this area, either side of the river, whether it was Maine or New Brunswick, but again, it was still in dispute in the 1830s, but would be to Old Town for lumbering. So Old Town does have some, if you wanted to just look in terms of geopolitical pieces here, Old Town does have some internal migration. There is a factor of that, but there are also people from Old Town that came from the Beauce region of Quebec and also came from elsewhere in Acadia from across the international border, especially southeastern New Brunswick and PEI. And you can usually tell by the last names of folks in Old Town as to where their ancestors came from. So Old Town gets a bit of an asterisk because some of that migration of French speakers came from up here, but other parts of it came from Quebec and from elsewhere in the part of Acadia that is physically in Canada as opposed to being in the U.S. As we are here in the Valley. And Lewiston, Auburn is another one. After World War I, there was an outmigration of folks up here to go work in some of the mills in Lewiston, Auburn. So there was a little bit, most of it was international, across an international border, down the old Canada Road, of course, or down the Grand Trunk Railway. And some of it, to a lesser extent, Lewiston and Auburn from Acadia, much lower percentage there. It's mostly from Quebec, of course, in that case. But again, a little bit of an asterisk with Lewiston and Auburn because of the internal migration from here in the Valley after World War I. So, yeah. So, but other than that, it's a very different story between the St. John Valley and the rest of New England just the migration patterns and the idea of the country coming to people here as opposed to the other way around, for the most part.
And so when you told that story about the, giving birth on the other side of the border, that's actually, it was funny. We got to that point in the interview you did with Fabrice is actually was like, yep, I'm going to ask this guy to be on the show for sure. Because I found that was super, super interesting. And for those people who are asking, I know that name, Fabrice Gaumont. He worked with Kathleen Stein-Smith to put together a book that I wrote a chapter on.
Yeah.
So,
awesome. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's where the would be familiar to a lot of people. And yes, I don't think people understand how far it is because we've talked forever about making the trip up to Fort Kent since Patrick moved there to try to visit the area. And from Manchester, New Hampshire, I checked, it's actually closer to go to Philadelphia, which is where I went to law school. That's an easier ride for me than it would be to go up to Fort Kent, Maine, which is nuts. You talked about the whole border situation. You did a presentation at a library that I found on YouTube and watched. That was super, super fascinating because you went like all these maps, like you followed the progression. It was awesome.
Yes, thank you. And that was at the Dover Foxcroft Library. That would have been the Thompson Free Library in the Maine Highlands for folks who are not familiar with that part of Maine. It's about up Route 15 from Bangor. If you're in Bangor and you go north and westward, it's about a half an hour roughly to Dover-ish, somewhere in that area. So, beautiful part of Maine. Dover is was a mill town, obviously, like so many areas in that section of Maine. So, and I did talk about those maps quite a bit, and many, many thanks to my friend and colleague, Dr. Libby Bischoff at the Ocean Map Library at the University of Southern Maine, who was kind enough to have me for a sabbatical several years ago. There are a lot of maps there that talk about the border dispute from so many different angles. There's one that I had particularly drew my attention, and I don't think it was actually I found this map later with Libby and her staff, but this map was from William Henderson, and it was done for the Lower Canada legislature. And just to give some historical context for folks, Lower Canada, Le Bas-Canada in French, Lower Canada is largely what we would consider the province of Quebec today. So it was done for the Lower Canada legislature in 1827. It basically talks about how the Madawaska settlement, and this is assuming, because this is, again, quick math, and I'm doing this off the top of my head. So 15 years before the final borders drawn in the river, and in 1842. This map, though, again, it's done for the Lower Canada legislature, which is, of course, it would have more of a British angle on it. So the person doing the map, William Henderson, basically talks about how the Madawaska settlement, which is what the St. John Valley is called, actually in French, across the river, they call it Le Madawaska Américain et Canadien. Okay. Here we just call it the Valley or the St. John Valley. Sure. And we'll get into that piece beyond just that different nomenclature on either side of the river. But they talk about, or Henderson talks about, how it would be of benefit because there was a dispute going on between the colony of New Brunswick, which was not, it was separate from Quebec at that point. Again, Confederation, of course, would change that in 1867, but at this time, New Brunswick was governed differently than was Lower Canada, and so there was a dispute between. Not only was there a dispute between the United States and British North America, Great Britain, with the border, there was also a dispute between the colony of New Brunswick and Lower Canada, which is now Quebec. Yeah. So on that map. Yeah, and again, that's kind of and I'm just thinking this, I'm talking out loud here, I'm thinking out loud. That map was done by the Lower Canada legislature, and so there's a bit more of a Lower Canada, I don't want to use the term necessarily bias, but more of a Lower Canada perspective, at least, on it, because it says that the Madawaska settlement would be better served, basically, I'm paraphrasing, if it were considered, which is this area now, on both sides of the border, on whether it's the Témiscouata region of Quebec, whether it's northernmost Maine, where I'm sitting, or northwestern New Brunswick. That was all kind of the Madawaska settlement. It would be better to place the Madawaska settlement in Lower Canada. They would have they would derive greater benefit from being part of Lower Canada. So it's quite fascinating. There's a little note in the map about that, and I actually made it larger. Same thing in French, je l'ai agrandi. I expanded it basically, and presented it. So yeah, it's fascinating when you look at these maps every single time. So I'd done a presentation as well for the Maine Archives and Museums Conference recently, and I was their keynote speaker in October of last year in 2023. And I talked about how and Libby was actually there, my friend and colleague, Dr. Libby Bischoff, she was actually at the conference. And I'd mentioned how every time we see a map, or at least in my case, every time I look at a map, even if I've seen it 5, 6, 7 times, I see something new every single time when I look at it. And there's nothing like, most of it's available digitally, no problem. But when you're actually down in Portland on the campus and you ask Libby or a member of her staff to pull out that map and put it on that table in front of you, it's an entirely different experience than seeing it on a computer screen. It is just and you notice it. That spatial piece is very important, literally and figuratively, because figuratively, of course, map, space, it's depicting something in space, but
Sure.
literally in the sense that it's literally right in front of you. The actual artifact is in front of you on a table as opposed to on a computer screen. It's an entirely different experience, and you see new things that way.
And it's funny because
every
you
time.
actually mentioned during that presentation on YouTube how you've grown up loving maps like forever. That's just been
Yes,
part of you. Yeah, it's cool.
And Jesse, I'm not trying to geek out here, but I suppose I will.
That's
I grew
awesome.
up with the Rand McNally Road Atlas, and every year my mom and my stepdad, they would, when I was a young kid, they would get me a new one. And then with the World Book, obviously encyclopedias, I'm of a certain age grew up before computers were an omnipresent
Sure.
piece of our lives. So the Road Atlas, but the World Book encyclopedia as well had lots of geographical references, and I would literally read the encyclopedia. I'd read my maps. I could get you from Annapolis to LA without having to look at a map because I'd read it so many times. Basically, it is very, 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 very
That's
easy
fun.
to do.
But no, it's funny because you talk about this whole thing with this area being in dispute between you New Brunswick and Lower Canada and what is going to be the United States. But that is just, for me, that's just puts it in, again, perspective that this is not in the middle of nowhere. This isn't just some middle of nowhere. This is right in the middle. This is a contested area in the middle of a whole bunch of things. Yes,
absolutely. Again, and it's fascinating even when I think, and this is just popping to mind since we're having a conversation, this reference comes to mind, and I've mentioned it elsewhere, but it's speaking to me at this moment. The book called L'Histoire du Madawaska, so History of Madawaska, the Madawaska settlement, not the town of Madawaska or Madawaska County, New Brunswick, the whole settlement, basically. The town of Madawaska is in Maine, for folks who don't know, but there's a Madawaska County, New Brunswick, right across the river from Madawaska, the village in Maine. So again, the Madawaska settlement,
sure,
which would include and it's funny because my native language is English, but I'm sitting here thinking in French because I do this in French so often.
That's awesome.
I'm actually having to kind of flip it in my head here. So the Madawaska settlement includes obviously northernmost Maine, northwestern New Brunswick, all of Madawaska County, New Brunswick, and county references in New Brunswick are simply historical references at this point. They don't really carry much judicial weight at all.
Gotcha.
That's not how New Brunswick is governed anymore. But you do still have the county. You still, like when you're driving on the trans or driving on, well, maybe not the trans, but on some of the smaller roads, you'll say Victoria County, Madawaska County, Restigouche County. Yeah, but in New Brunswick, though, it doesn't really have any kind of judicial weight anymore. But still, it's good for reference for us here. So Madawaska County, part western Restigouche would be part of what was the old Madawaska settlement, and northernmost Victoria County, the area around Grand Falls, basically, would be part of the old Madawaska settlement, as would be everything pretty much in the central and eastern St. John Valley, if not all of it, but certainly central and eastern St. John Valley. And when we're talking western, we're going out toward the Allagash, and of course, a very strong Scots-Irish presence out in the Allagash for sure. Many folks of Scots-Irish descent out that way. But as we work further east, though, it's mostly French speakers. Once you get from St. Francis eastward, that part of the St. John Valley, certainly St. Francis East, and then up into the Témiscouata region, or Témiscouata in French, region of Quebec. That was the old Madawaska settlement. So when we think in those terms, this, like you said, Jesse, it's the center of the action. But again, Thomas Albert, whom I'd mentioned, who wrote the History of Madawaska, he saw this area, all those areas that I mentioned, those parts of New Brunswick, the Témiscouata region of Quebec, and then this part of northern Maine, as being a bridge really between French Canadians and Acadians. Now, again, on the US side of the river, most folks that I know, and again, I'm not of Acadian or French descent, but this is just anecdotal, just in talking to my friends and colleagues around here. Most folks that I know on the US side tend to self-appropriate an Acadian identity on the US side. There are some folks, I do know, I have some friends around here who, if you ask them what their background is, je suis français, moi. Je suis française, moi. You know, so I'm French, which kind of implies more Quebec more than Acadia. But you'll have plenty of people who will say, je suis acadien, je suis acadienne. That you'll hear more often, but you will hear some folks who'll say, je suis français, je suis française. You'll hear both on the US side, but mostly Acadian, yes, for sure. And again, the way we self-appropriate identity, that's up to us. Absolutely. I'm just talking in terms of Thomas Albert. He sees it kind of as a bridge between the two. So the New Brunswick side basically is a bit more of a mixed bag, because you will hear some folks that will appropriate an identity that some folks call Brayon or Brayon. You will hear that. You'll also, though, hear Acadien, Acadienne. You'll hear Madawaskayen, Madawaskayen. So someone from the Madawaska region.
Sure.
You might hear, let's see, well, obviously in the Témiscouata region, you'll hear Québécois, you know, obviously, because it's in the province of Quebec, but, you know, it has Acadian history to it, right? That particular region, the MRC Témiscouata, which is the Municipalité Régionale de Comté, Madawaska. So that's what it's short for. Just the county regional municipality of not Madawaska, of Témiscouata. I'm sorry, of Témiscouata in Quebec. So that's how things are kind of divided in Quebec. They're called MRCs in French. You know, just that area. So some folks in Témiscouata will assume an Acadian identity, and that's more, especially since the World Acadian Congress was held in this international region in 2014. The first time it was held in an international region, basically. So it would have included this area of northern Maine, northwestern New Brunswick, and the Témiscouata region of Quebec, basically, which is the old Madawaska settlement. So for the first time, and the World Acadian Congress, for folks who are not familiar, is held every 5 years in different parts of literally the world that have Acadian background. Mm-hmm. Most of the time, I don't think it's ever been held outside of North America, but of course there are Acadians who live in France, you know, with the whole the great upheaval. There were some Acadians that, even though their ancestors had been in the Americas for 4, 5, 6, 7 generations at that point, at the time of the great upheaval in the 1750s, still many did end up in France. And notice I did not say back to France, because the ancestors were here for 6 or 7 generations.
Sure.
But many ended up in France, where their ancestors had come from long ago. But I don't know, there has not been a World Acadian Congress in France, not to my knowledge anyway. But Louisiana, yes, definitely. In the Maritimes in Canada, and then also in this area here, which includes part of the Maritimes, of course, northwestern New Brunswick, but the Témiscouata region of Quebec and northern Maine as well. So it
is cool.
That's fascinating. And I know that I have some links to Louisiana as well. I have some, and it's not part of the family that I knew personally, but I know that I have some links to Louisiana on my mom's side. Just some biological links anyway to Louisiana. And then my stepdad, who was of African-American descent, but he was from Louisiana, not from the French or the Creole portion. He was from the Florida parishes, but I still have that Louisiana connection. So somehow, I don't know how or why, but there's something about French language that's just always kind of resonated with me. I mean, yeah, the trip to Quebec in 1983 when I was a teenager, but also just the Louisiana piece. There's just something with that that kind of hits me a certain way that I can't explain at all.
Here in Manchester, it's within the living memory of people who are still alive today, mm-hmm. who can remember in Manchester living their entire lives in French.
Yes.
Where they did not, like my grandfather, when he was alive, we would talk about the fact that he could go entire weeks without ever having to speak English, never had to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it, we've talked about, what happened, because my generation, a lot of times, is the very first who does not speak it as a first language, which is 100% true in my family. Mm-hmm. And both my parents spoke French as their first language. We talk about, what happened. Why did this slow down after, generations of people living in the United States and speaking French as their first language? What stopped? And something we hear about, or at least one of the many reasons given, is when people stopped coming down from Quebec all the time. There are less people moving into the area, and those people obviously brought their French language with them, and then they kind of
Yes.
refreshed the language for everybody. And I'm wondering, is there a noticeable difference now with the border not being as fluid up where you are as it used to be, that perhaps you could start seeing some of the same kind of issues that we saw like a generation ago, 2 generations ago here in Manchester?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. And I would lean back on what I was talking about with regard to people here, the country coming to them, and not the other way around. So the language is transmitted on both sides, generally orally. Now, on the New Brunswick side, and certainly Quebec as well, the schools are in French, whereas here, we had a move toward a bilingual education program, but unfortunately, there were several issues along the way where it is no longer the case. French is still taught in school, but here on the U.S. side, it's largely been transmitted, especially in the last several generations, orally. But it's difficult. The border piece, yes, does play a role, but I would contend, and this is just my historical contention, and it's an arguable point, certainly, that the damage done from this law from 1919 until the late 1960s, where you could not teach anything but English at school and French only as a foreign language in a place where English is the foreign language.
Sure.
Hello.
Yeah.
That has done damage, and we're still, even 50 plus years away from that, we're still digging out of that, where I don't know how many, and again, I'm in my mid 50s. I was born in 1969. And I don't know how many of my friends were born and raised here who were native French speakers, which I'm not, but who are native French speakers from this area, French speakers from this area. Even a generation ago, they would say, sometimes some of my friends would say to their kids, we don't want you to go through what I did at school, getting punished for speaking French. So that is part of the reason why it's being lost. Another part probably is the social media piece, and most of social media is in English. And yeah, the border does play a role. There isn't as much traffic across the border as there used to be. There are still people that are going to go see, I don't know, ma tante José de l'autre. My
Sure.
aunt José, or mon oncle Yvon de l'autre. They go see my uncle Yvon on the other side. Yeah, there are, and I don't have a Tante José or an Oncle Yvon. I'm just picking two names just to kind of give the example.
Mémé and Pepe, yes.
Right. Mémé and Pepe, yeah. Mémé de l'Aube, Saint-Jacques, she lives in Saint-Jacques, which is now part of Edmundston, technically, but Saint-Jacques is Saint-Jacques. So it's that same idea. Yes, you do still have that, but there is a little bit less border traffic than there used to be. 9/11 has had something to do with that. I do think social media and other pieces, the punishment piece, where the language didn't get passed down, it's slowly eroding on the US side, I don't think. And even for me, it can become emotional. I don't think it's going to be gone, but it's slowing down, and you can see it.
Yeah.
You can see it, and you can feel it. Most people my age who are born and raised on this side do speak French, and some may answer you in English, but they do speak French. Once you get under 40, there's a pretty precipitous drop off. I'd say 40 is kind of the cutoff in most of the main part of the St. John Valley. Of course, it's on both sides of the river, but outside of Fort Kent, I'd say it's under 40. In Fort Kent, I'd even push it to maybe 45, under 45. Fort Kent is just as French as the rest of the valley. I do have to say, though, I'm sitting in an institution here that has a lot of native English speakers in it, so that changes the equation a little bit. The hospital has a lot of people from elsewhere as well that were English speaking here in Fort Kent, whereas the rest of the valley doesn't have that. So there's a little bit, just a slight difference, I find anyway. This is just my experience.
Sure.
In Fort Kent versus the rest of the St. John Valley as far as the loss of language. And I can especially see it in people that are maybe, because I taught at Wisdom Middle High School in Senegat again, and most of my youngest students at this point, when we're doing the recording of this podcast, are in their roughly late 20s, kind of 27-ish, somewhere in there. In that last class that I had taught at Wisdom, a good quarter of that class could still carry at least a basic, if not a full conversation in French, even back then. But I look at a lot of my, and I do have some friends that are in their 20s and people that I know in their 20s here in Fort Kent, and a lot of the folks that I know here that are in their late 20s, there are many that don't even understand French, and the vast majority do not speak. So again,
Oh,
even in
wow.
Fort Kent, just even there, you're seeing it. But there are always going to be those who can,
Of
because
course.
maybe they have one Canadian parent, or maybe they're just interested in it and really they really kind of hold to their culture and into the language piece. But again, I'm seeing a precipitous drop off after those. Again, even that quarter that could speak, when I was at Wisdom in St. Agathe, which is kids from St. Agatha and Frenchville, St. Agathe and Frenchville, as well as Sinclair, which is the next town below St. Agathe. There, even the kids who did not speak, most of them could understand because of Meme or Pepe. They
Yeah.
understood enough French. So, whereas here in Fort Kent, unfortunately, under 30, yeah, some do, but there are a lot of folks at that age who don't even really understand. So, and again, I'm not casting blame. That's
Of
the last
course.
thing. This is more of an observation just to
Yeah.
kind of show that there's language loss here, because it's very, there's so many different factors that are involved here. But it is, and I admit it's hard for me to talk about, even though it's not my culture of origin. I've been adopted here.
You're there now. Absolutely.
You know, like I said, even in talking to you, Jesse, answering some of your questions in English, I'm actually thinking first in French, and I'm kind of like, wait a minute, this is my native language, but I'm having to kind of do some mental gymnastics, not
Sure.
translating in my head as such, because as a language teacher, you don't. That's one thing we counsel against. We don't want you to, but still, just kind of reframing my brain to English here. So it's become, fortunately, I'm grateful that I've been so accepted here. You know, but it definitely is it's very emotional when you see that. It's hard to watch that happen, but it is part of the acculturation, and dare I say assimilation. I don't even like that word, but the acculturation piece to English. And I don't know, but I do sense that at least there's going to be some French on this side because of the proximity of obviously Edmundston and the Témiscouata region of Quebec. There's still going to be that, but it just won't be as much right now anyway, because we're seeing it diminish under, like I said, under about 40 years old. It's tough to see it, but it is happening. Yeah.
I guess it's just the next part of the story of what is just a crazy, fascinating region that most people have no idea about. Even like I'm from New England, I had no idea about this until I started this podcast. This is a super, super interesting place.
And we're always learning new things. And I was talking to some of my history students today about that in my US class. I said, you all teach me stuff all the time, and I appreciate it. You know, I had one student in front of me that had a question I couldn't answer, and if I don't know, I'm going to say I don't know. I need to go and research it. Actually, it happened with a different student today too, who asked me a question. I said, I'm not sure. I'm going to have to go check, and I'll get back to you. So again, yeah. So we're always learning new stuff. Everybody, whether we're professionally trained in history, which I happen to be, I'm still learning stuff every single day of the week. So. And I'm grateful for my students who stump me and ask really, really good questions. And so, yeah. And like you said, you learned about this area, even though you grew up in New England, you said?
Manchester, New Hampshire.
In Manchester. You did grow up in Manchester. Yeah.
Well,
so I guess what I'm saying, Jesse, is please don't feel bad about it.
At some point, you can make the trip to Manchester. I'll give you a tour of all the French sites for
that
sure.
Would be awesome. That would be awesome. And
And
thank you so much.
Now it's even more reason why Mike and I need to get in the car and make a trip up to Fort Kent.
Come on up.
We got it, and we'll connect over there. We'll grab Patrick, because this is it is such a unique story.
And remember to, if you do come up anytime soon, remember to bring your passport, because you obviously want to see what's across the river too.
Oh yeah, so, I'd swing by Quebec City on the way home.
Oh good, yeah, there you go.
I love that town, but this has been a blast.
That's where I learned my French. Actually, was in Quebec City. I was at Université Laval I almost said in French, 1989. Yep. So that was my first time outside of the U.S. in an immersive environment. That's where I really learned my French. So Quebec City has a special place with me, no doubt about it.
I love it. Well, this has flown by. This has been way fun. We've been speaking with Dr. Paul Buck, professor at the University of Maine, Fort Kent. Dr. Buck, this has been a blast. Thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you, Jesse. I appreciate it. And we will talk soon.
Now our fathers look at us and sigh with despair, to think that everything they love we simply do not share. But the spirit never die, so our culture will survive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive. Each of us must choose how much to keep alive.
Special thanks to Josie Vachon for providing the music. You can find more about her at josievachon.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Mike Campbell. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at fclpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at FCL Podcast for more information about the topics discussed. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to this episode.